Hey guys, Buildzoid here, and today I just want to make a video sort of setting expectations about the Intel 14th gen memory controller and its support for like high-speed XMPs, because Intel in their own launched a marketing material. They have this video where it's like, oh yeah, XMP beyond the DDR5 8000 is like supported now. And then if you go to the motherboard manufacturer websites, you will see QVLs just absolutely stuffed with DDR5 8000 ratings. Um, Even on motherboards where I seriously doubt it is going to work because this has entirely too many DIMM slots. Um, and yeah, like, Asus has 8000 on there. MSI is only up at 7800. I don't know. Like, the issue is, I don't know if that's because the Z790 Godlike Max is, like, worse at memory overclocking than the Dark Hero or the Nova, or if it's just because MSI is being more realistic about the capabilities of the average Intel CPU. Um, it's impossible to know. And then you have Gigabyte over here with a QVL that goes all the way up to 8266, um, which, yeah, also with the Z790 refresh boards, Gigabyte is now using the same 8-layer daisy chain topology for both their, like, top-of-the-line Aorus Extreme X, as well as the Aorus Elite, as well as, like, the lowest-end Aorus Elite X. So that insane 8266 QVL is now on both of the boards. So, so Intel is like, yeah, DDR5 8000 XMP supported. The motherboard manufacturers are like, DDR5 8000 XMP totally supported. Like, yeah, is totally going to work. And then you get to the actual DDR5 8000 rated memory kits, and they're not even that insanely priced these days. Though I will point, well, we'll get to get to that later, but I mean, they're not cost effective. You can get Hynix like you can, because these are just arguably high bin Hynix 8. I don't know if they're actually better binned, because it's not like I've tested 100 sticks of 7200 rated memory against 100 sticks of 8000 rated memory to know if there's, or you probably wouldn't have to go through 100 kits, but you'd want to go through at least like 10 or something before you go and say, oh yeah, the 8000 rated kits are definitely better binned, because, well, how many people do you know that tested 20 memory sticks to, or not 20 memory sticks, but like 40 memory sticks to actually make that kind of statement? So, but yeah, so in terms of like, if your goal is to get some Hynix A die, there are much cheaper ways of doing that than buying a DDR5 8000 rated kit. And if your goal is to get 24 gigabit M die, yeah, there's cheaper ways of doing that than buying a DDR5 8000 rated kit. So DDR5 8000 it's not cost effective, but it's not insanely, it's not insanely expensive anymore. The motherboards all claim to support it. Intel claims to support it. And then, so like I actually have a Z790 Aorus Extreme X, which was provided by Gigabyte. So thank you to them for sending the board over. And I also have a memory kit that happens to be featured on the QVL for this motherboard. It's this one right here, right? It's a 24 gig, it's the 2x24 V-Color DDR5 8000 kit that I have. I have had that kit do like a fully stable DDR5 8000 on a Ryzen 7900X with a B650E Tachyon. So the kit is certainly capable of running DDR5 8000. I've also had it running DDR5 8000 on the Z790 Apex. And also that kit was provided by V-Color. I do also have a 14900K, which was provided by Intel. So, I took this DDR5 8000 memory kit, which according to Gigabyte, it should work at XMP. That's kind of the whole point of having a freaking QVL, is that the QVL is like this. These are the XMP speeds that we support, right? Intel says 14th gen supports XMP at 8000 and higher. And so, yeah, here's my 14th gen CPU on my, on the $1,000 Gigabyte motherboard with the 8000 rated memory kit, which definitely does do 8000 on other motherboards with, other CPUs. And yeah, you turn on XMP and you get 7 errors in 16 seconds of RAM test. Also, Y-Cruncher just has a complete meltdown within the first iteration. There's there's calculation errors across multiple cores. In fact, there's so many errors across so many cores that we can't even see the start of calculation message. For comparison, this is what happens at 7800, right? You can see just one of the cores errored out, and we can actually still see the start of the test instead of just having like core 25 failed, core 24 failed. Basically, I'm not sure that literally every core failed, but a bunch of them did. Because the memory was just completely unstable, so the cores were trying to run calculations with invalid data, which doesn't tend to go very well. But actually, they were not necessarily even trying to run the correct calculations, right? Because even the algorithm that the benchmark is running is stored in the memory, so even that can get corrupted. It's not just the data that goes into the equations. The equation itself can get mangled. But anyway, so yeah, this is extremely unstable. And, you know, according to Gigabyte's QVL, it should work. Right? Like, that's the whole freaking point of XMP and QVLs, is that if you don't know how to overclock, you can buy a memory kit that's on the QVL, turn on XMP, and, you know, not get this. At least that's the idea. That's my understanding of why XMP exists, is so that people who don't want to deal with stress testing and fiddling with voltages can go buy faster memory that's rated above JEDEC spec, right? Except a lot of the time, if you do that, you get this. Like, you just get this. And then, yeah, at 7800, it's still incredibly unstable. And at 7600, the XMP, like, you know, if I turn on XMP and drop the speed to 7600, it actually passes. This also works with the 13900KS, and the 13900KS also doesn't work at 7800 or 8000. So, though, funnily enough, the 14900K on a Z790 Apex, and that is the old Apex, not the new refresh Apex, yeah, the 14900K does actually do 8000 on that board. The 13900KS with the XMP profile, yeah, that doesn't work. This is actually just XMP. I mean, I did fiddle with the timings, as in I tightened the timings, but I only did that after I realized that, hey, I can turn on the XMP profile and not be greeted by a pile of errors. Yeah, so this combination of like 14900K on Z790 Apex with the V-Color memory kit, yeah, that works at DDR5 8000. And that works as in you can just turn on the XMP profile and it works. But then you also have to consider the fact that I also have a 13900KS where this doesn't work. I have a 13900K where this doesn't work. I have a 13600K where this doesn't work. So I have like 1 out of 4 Intel CPUs where this is functional. Now, admittedly, the other 3 CPUs are listed off our 13th gen, but actually, you know what? Let's just take a look at the QVL for the Z790 Apex for 13th gen. The old one, the white one. And if we go to support, memory support, and if we go, actually, is this, so 13th gen K series. Though, I guess, admittedly, I'm not seeing that V-Color kit up here. So, maybe that's not expected to work. But we do have a bunch of, like, 8000 rated kits. Though, I do actually have... I'm not sure I actually tried that at 7800. With the 13900KS. Though, I know for a fact that with my 13900K, that kit does not work. And that is technically a 13th gen K SKU, so, you know. Anyway, so at this point you might be wondering, okay, but how do motherboard manufacturers make these QVLs with these insane speeds if, you know, this happens when you turn on the XMP. Like, do they just not do any stress testing? Because I've seen people say, oh, like motherboard manufacturers don't, like the QVL is just like, hey, this posts. And that's not actually the case. The motherboard manufacturers do actually stress test the memory kits that go onto the QVL. But the difference between you or me and motherboard manufacturers is that motherboard manufacturers have access to hundreds of CPUs. So when the memory kit, like, so when the stress test fails, they can just swap the CPU. And they can keep doing that until the stress test stops failing. Because the thing with Intel, actually, yeah, well, especially the DDR5 Intel CPUs, the memory controller is really, really inconsistent in terms of like silicon quality. As in, the gap between like the very worst 13th gen CPUs and the very best 13th gen CPUs is something like 1400 megabits per second. As in, there are 13th gen chips out there that'll run stress tests like to this level of stability where it's like, yeah, over an hour of Y cruncher and, 8+ hours of RAM test at DDR5 8400 or higher even. And then there's also CPUs where even if you do have a Z790 Apex and you do have an 8000 rated memory kit, 7200 will still be an incredible struggle to get working. Because Intel doesn't care about the like quality of the memory controllers, right? Like officially, the memory controller on a 14th gen CPU or a 13th gen CPU, and I didn't pull up the ARC website, so, or I guess we're just going to do that now, 14900K ARC. So officially, Intel supports up to 5600, right? Which literally every CPU that they ever produce probably does. That's kind of the point. So the end result is that, like, Intel just doesn't care if they, like, they will quite happily put out a 14900K with a memory controller that'll... I'm not, well... I really hope that there aren't 14900Ks out there that can't do DDR5 7200. My 13900K can't. But, like, I'd be hoping that, like, at this point, the manufacturing process has gotten consistent enough that that no longer happens. But I don't know. I have one 14900K, and I don't have any binning statistics for, like, large numbers of CPUs. But, yeah, even then, it's like Intel doesn't really care if a 14900K goes out ends up, goes out the factory with a memory controller that maxes out at 7200 or if it maxes out at 8400. That's just not a concern because officially it only supports 5600. So from Intel's perspective, this whole situation of like, oh yeah, you can buy memory kits that you can buy a memory kit for your $1,000 motherboard, or even more expensive, but $1,000 motherboard, $600 CPU, right? Because the 14900K's MSRP is what? Yeah, $600 CPU, $1,000 motherboard, and then you can buy like a $200 to like $500 memory kit, turn on the XMP profile, and it isn't going to work. And Intel is completely fine with that because officially they don't support anything more than 5600. And the motherboard manufacturers are completely fine with this situation because when you enable XMP and it doesn't work and then you call them up for support, they're going to tell you that your CPU just isn't good enough or that the memory kit is defective. So, from the motherboard manufacturer's perspective, this is fine. The fact that, they make QVLs with, I don't know what statistic CPUs, right? Like, if I had to guess, this is like top 5%, maybe less than that, right? Of 14th gen CPUs are actually capable of doing this. But the issue is, it is a good marketing thing to stuff your QVL full of memory kits that won't work for most people, right? Because if you're, uninformed and you're trying to choose a motherboard, you might look at like a Z790 Nova or a dark and a dark hero and a godlike, and you might look at the QVL and, you might be wondering, so which of these motherboards is going to allow me to run the fastest memory kit? And you're going to look at the QVL and you're going to see like, oh, the godlike only supports 7800. So this is worse than the Nova because the Nova claims to support 8000, and the Nova is about the same as the Hero because the Hero claims to only support 8000. And then this Gigabyte Z790 Extreme X or even the Elite X are actually like this is actually a better memory overclocking motherboard because the QVL has 8266 on it. What I think is actually happening here is that Gigabyte is using maybe a top 1% CPU. ASRock and Asus and ASRock might be using a top 10%, maybe top 20% CPU. MSI's over here, like, I'm actually not sure. It could actually, this is the issue. This is the other issue is like, because you don't know what, like, memory controller quality CPUs are being used to generate these QVLs, maybe this motherboard is actually just worse, right? And maybe the 7800 is with a top 1% CPU, and like MSI is desperately trying to brute force the QVL on this thing to not look completely terrible. Or maybe they're just using a realistic a more average CPU instead of a less average, more than average CPU, or literally the greatest silicon Intel has produced in several years, in the case of the Gigabyte QVLs. And the other issue I have with this is this compresses the, perceived differences between motherboards, right? Because you don't really get XMP memory kits above 8000. That's just not really a thing, right? So when Asus then produces a QVL for something like an Apex, right? When Asus is making a QVL for a CPU for a motherboard like the Apex, right? It doesn't end up with super insane memory speeds on it compared to something like a Dark Hero, because and in the past, Gigabyte would actually Gigabyte at this point used to make memory kits. When Gigabyte was making memory kits, they would make custom memory kits with insane XMP profiles so that they could get even higher QVL, even higher numbers onto the QVL. They're not going to be doing that anymore because they decided to stop making memory kits. Apparently, selling RAM isn't super profitable, which, yeah, it's not too surprising. But yeah, the issue is the actual memory kits that exist that you could populate your QVL with, they don't go that high. Wait. And yeah, you end up with this ridiculous situation where a motherboard that this is the motherboard that Asus is using to break world records for memory speeds right now. Right now, Asus holds the memory speed world record, and it was done with an Apex Encore. And when you look at the QVL, it's oh, this looks the same as the Dark Hero. Because, this needs a maybe I don't know what percentage CPU to do 8000. This would probably do it with, I'm not going to say an average CPU because I don't know what the average is. It's entirely possible that every single Intel chip that I have for LGA 1700 is slightly below average. Because I don't know why else I have so many issues with DDR5 8000, even on boards like an Apex. Yeah, this frustrates me because you have this compression of difference between motherboards. The Apex Encore, if this QVL was realistic, I would expect this to be at least 400 megabits per second higher QVL than the Hero. Yeah, at a minimum. But because XMP kits only go up to 8000-ish, we have this really dumb situation where we have a 4-DIMM daisy chain motherboard with a QVL that looks awfully similar to a 1 DIMM per channel. Because they just don't, like, there aren't kits rated any higher than this. And then the really, and you know, there is a workaround to this. Instead of looking at Intel, like, instead of reading like Intel marketing materials or motherboard manufacturer marketing materials, you could just go to the actual memory manufacturers, right? Like G.Skill. And the reason I chose G.Skill specifically is because G.Skill's QVLs match my experience with Intel motherboards most closely. And a lot of other memory manufacturers don't even bother having their own QVLs, which, I mean, fair enough. If the motherboard manufacturers are going to slap whatever onto their own official lists, then why even bother? But yeah, so here we have this, G.Skill 8000 CL40 kit, which does show up on the QVL for the Dark Hero. Right? It's this one right here. And, oh. Well, that's an awfully short QVL. I wonder why that would be. There's a really simple answer for this. G.Skill doesn't want to deal with your complaints about the memory kit not working, probably. Right? And this is actually realistic. Like, this right here lines up with my expectations. Basically, if your motherboard has more than one DIMM slot for each channel, then it ain't gonna work. And if you go to the memory configurator from G.Skill, right, you can do, like, where this is, like, because the thing is, I didn't want to, like, click around through the random memory kits, because if we click on, like, a 7600, which you'd think, oh, this would be compatible with a whole bunch of motherboards, right? Yeah, no, not really. But, you know, you might be thinking, oh, maybe this just isn't up to date. Well, if we go to the RAM configurator from G.Skill and we search for something like a Godlike, it literally won't let me select speeds higher than 7200. And if I choose a Z790i Edge Wi-Fi, I wonder if how that'll work out. Also only go up to 7200. So I guess they might not have updated the QVLs completely. But if we go to Asus and go Z790 DDR5 14th gen, and then we pick out, say, the Dark Hero, yeah, that still only goes to 7200. And if I choose a, say, where's the Apex Encore? And why is the website so jank? We have the regular Apex, but I want the new one. Oh, there's the new one. Yeah, so that, you know, that has QV, like, that is on the RAM configurator all the way up to 8200. So basically, like, G.Skill's QVLs are I'd say very realistic. Maybe even a little bit lower, like a little unnecessarily low, maybe. But if your goal is to have a system where you turn on XMP and it just works, then G.Skill's QVLs are by far the closest to reality compared to the stuff that the motherboard manufacturers put out, because they just bin the CPUs into doing whatever it is that they want to put on the QVL. Because ultimately, like, they're not expecting to really have to, like, I'm assuming they just don't plan to deal with the issue when it doesn't work. Right? And yeah, and so that's the point of this video, because like, I think this is completely stupid, because the whole point of XMP is that, like, people who don't want to deal with the intricacies and stress, like the intricacies of memory overclocking, can go buy a memory kit that's on the QVL with the appropriate XMP profile, stick it in their motherboard, turn the XMP on, and not get this. Because this is unusable. Okay, if you're getting 7 errors within 16 seconds of RAM test, this is on the level of, like, the system randomly locks up for no reason. That's like how bad the instability is in this scenario, okay? Like, if this was like an hour before any errors showed up, then it's like, okay, you could maybe kind of use the system. It would probably be really, like, it would probably corrupt your file system after some time, and your OS would just, like, destroy itself. But, it wouldn't be completely unusable. This is completely unusable. This is on the level of, like, you know, sometimes it doesn't get to the Windows desktop. And yet, you know, I am using a QVL memory kit on a $1,000 motherboard with the 14th gen CPU. Supposedly this should work. And so, yeah, I think it is ridiculous that we're in this situation where, basically because of, like, marketing, we have motherboard manufacturers just kind of cramming unrealistic XMPs into their QVLs, which leads to things like I'm annoyed that it, like, compresses the perceived difference between a motherboard like a Dark Hero and an Apex, because realistically, the Apex is much, much better than a Dark Hero when it comes to memory overclocking. In fact, it's much, much better than basically everything when it comes to memory overclocking. But you can't see that from the QVL because the QVLs for the, like, 4 dimmers are inflated. Really badly in some cases, right? Because, like, and the other issue is, and the funny, like, and the other issue is, in some cases, the QVLs are actually realistic, right? And so the problem is, like, it's just a mess. And when I say sometimes realistic, I don't mean, like, specifically for Z790, the QVLs are kind of insane from most of the motherboard manufacturers. But if you go back to, like, other motherboard generations, there are certain, like, chipsets and sockets where the QVLs weren't completely nuts. But yeah, like, this what we have with Z790, like, this is ridiculous. 'Cause just, like, what is the point of having a QVL and XMP that don't work? Like, it's just completely failing, and it's at its, like, core purpose of providing high performance memory to people who don't want to deal with overclocking, right? Because alternatively, what motherboards could do is just say, oh yeah, if you know how to overclock, you can run DDR5 whatever, right? And all memory kits should just come at JDEC. And it's like, oh, if you want to run DDR5 8000, you just got to learn how to overclock yourself. And then then I wouldn't be quite so annoyed by this, because this situation where it's like, yeah, but I can literally, like, you know, $1,000 motherboard, $600 CPU, $200 to $400 memory kit. You put these 3 things together, you turn on the XMP, it doesn't freaking work. Which is just like that's, like, I wouldn't, like, because the thing is, and I'm not annoyed that these, like, high-speed memory kits exist. I am on it, like, as an overclocker, I appreciate the fact that, like, you can go and get memory sticks that are pre-tested to work at DDR5 8000. That's cool. But I don't think it's cool that we have motherboard manufacturers acting like those memory kits are going to work on freaking 4 dimmers. Right? Like, and with 13th gen, like, I remember receiving multiple messages from people who bought, like, daisy chain motherboards, so various 4 dimmers. Like, when I say daisy chain, I just mean 4 dimmer motherboards, right? And say DDR5 7600 rated memory kits, and they'd be like, yo, Buildzoid, my system isn't stable. And my response was like, well, drop it to 7200 or something. Like, because it is, like, basically you were lied to by the manufacturer about what's realistically going to work. because it's not going to work. And the issue is like even the old motherboards would like very regularly claim to support 7600, right? So like I don't have a original Extreme. I only have the refresh, so can't really use that. But where is it? Z790. Where's the regular master? So yeah, you have the regular master. The QVL for this board is just like, it goes up to 8,000. I can assure you that this board does not compare to an Apex. Not the old one, not the old one or the new one. In terms of memory overclocking capabilities. Like, I have a Z790 Aorus Master. It struggles to boot 7600. It can kind of work at 7400, and realistically, I wouldn't want to run it at above 7200. Like, and even at 7200, if you get unlucky with the CPU, you have to like manually set a bunch of extra voltages that no XMP profile will ever configure. And so, yeah, like, I think this just kind of needs to stop. Especially now that like these high-speed memory kits aren't insanely the prices on these memory kits aren't insanely high, because I don't think it's that ridiculous that somebody might buy like a, $400 motherboard, $600 CPU, or $400 CPU and a $200 memory kit. Like, the memory kit, comparatively to the rest of the parts, isn't that expensive, especially if they're buying like a 4090 or something, right? But that memory kit is not going to freaking work in a lot of cases. I'm not saying in all cases, right? Because again, there are CPUs that do actually, do these insane speeds on these motherboards. They're just not very common. And also, I'm sure that whatever CPU does 8266 on the Aorus Extreme X would do like 8800 on an Apex. Yeah, probably like 8800 on an Apex. And so, yeah, and like, because I'm just pulling up the old Apex here because I want to point out how just like dumb it is that like for 13th gen K SKUs, right? This claims support up to 8,000, and then it's like, oh, so the Apex is like the same memory, like equally good in memory overclocking to an Aorus Master, and it's just like, no. Like, the Master I have won't even boot 8,000. Like, it won't even try. Like, it's like 76. Like, I can take screenshots of 7600 on the Z790 Aorus Master that I have. And I've heard from other people who have Z790 Aorus Masters who've had the same experience, where it's like, yeah, you go above like 7400 and the board just becomes completely unusable. And it's probably just because they didn't get lucky enough with the CPU. But honestly, it's hard to say because, how many people are going to go out and like there isn't a standardized test motherboard for CPUs, right? So if you like, you can't really draw conclusions from like, oh, this CPU hits this speed on this motherboard, and then the other issue is like you have also scenarios like say my 13900KS and 14900K where it's like the 13900KS and the 14900K max out at the same speed on the Z790 Aorus Extreme X, but on the Apex, the 14900K actually runs Y-Cruncher, whereas the 13900KS doesn't. At least, well, no, it doesn't. If I just turn on XMP, it doesn't. If you spend a bunch of time tuning the voltages, it might. But at this point, I've just given up on dealing with Intel's memory controller because it's just annoying. It is annoying as hell, and I don't want to deal with it. Partially because the like quality spread is so large. Partially because the motherboard QVLs, like the QVLs are just insane. for a lot of motherboards. And like, I don't know what a fix for this is, because yeah, like I don't really see a fix for this. Like I think it, like I would really like personally, in an ideal world, I'd love to know what percentage of CPUs hits 8266 on the Aorus Extreme X. Not because it would be particularly useful information, I'd just like to know. I think that would be kind of cool to see, like, oh yeah, this is, like, is it top 10%? Top 5? Top 1? 0.1? I don't think it would be 0.1 because, like, motherboard vendors get sent a lot of CPUs, but I don't think they would, go through 1,000 CPUs just to produce QVLs, but I guess it depends how desperate they are to have extra marketing points. But yeah, I don't know. Like alternatively, you could have like the standardized Intel QVL CPU, which would be like pre-tested by Intel, right? They could like because Intel would be able to generate like very if Intel wanted to, they could produce like a standard Intel 14900K that motherboard vendors could use to produce QVLs, right? And then you'd have QVLs that would be actually reflective of the capabilities of the motherboards instead of how much binning went into it. But I don't think anybody involved in I don't think the motherboard manufacturers would care for that. I don't think Intel cares for it either. And so, yeah, like I don't think this is going to get fixed, but it could be fixed. Like you could just have a standardized CPU that, and by standardized CPU, like you would basically bin a entire batch of like, I don't know, say 100 chips, where it's like these all have roughly the same memory controller. And those 100 chips would be used by, or more than 100, but like, you get the idea. Like you'd have this like large quantity of very similar CPUs, ideally relatively close to average silicon quality, right? And those would then be used to generate the QVLs instead of the current situation where it's like a complete free-for-all as to who can bin harder. That leads to, silly QVLs like what we have on the Aorus Extreme X. And funnily enough, I have actually seen a screenshot of a 13700K running 8266Y Cruncher on an Aorus Elite X. But that CPU also does much, much higher speeds on an Apex. So, yeah, you just gotta bin harder if you want high-speed memory support on Intel motherboards. Like, you just need to buy more CPUs, and if you buy enough CPUs, eventually you'll get whatever speed is on the QVL to work. But honestly, it's like not a good situation. Anyway, this video is way longer than it needs to be, but yeah, like I'm not reshooting it at this point. So anyway, that's it. Like, don't buy DDR5 8000 rated kits, though I will say one thing. If you are going to buy a DDR5 8000 rated kit because you want to do like silly high memory speeds, get 24 gig DIMMs. They are significantly easier to run at high speeds than 16 gig DIMMs, which is another dumb thing. Well, actually, you can kind of see that from the QVLs for some of the motherboards, right? Like, if you look at the Dark Hero, you're going to notice that it's only 24 gig DIMMs that are doing 8000, and then, like, 7600 is the next speed down, and that's where you start seeing... Actually, you don't even see 16 gig DIMMs at 7600. Oh, I guess the QVL might not be completely finished yet. But hey, they managed to pack a bunch of 8000 kits into it, didn't they? Yeah, so the 24 gig DIMMs are much, much easier to run, like, hit high memory speeds with. You can see that also with ASRock, right? Like ASRock has a bunch of 24 gig DIMMs for the 8000, and then you have a 16 for 7800, and then you start seeing like a lot. Well, there's a lot of 16s at 7800. I guess there's maybe not that many 24 gig DIMMs that are binned to 7800, but anyway, if you look at the gigabyte QVL, everything goes. 16, okay, no, you still get that same effect of like the really, really high speeds are 24 gig DIMMs, and then everything below that you start getting the 16 gig DIMMs. So, yeah, if you are going to buy silly DDR5 sticks, buy the 24 gig ones, because they do, like, those are significantly easier to hit high clocks on. They're still probably not going to work, right? Like, I'm just going to point out the fact that, like, yeah, I'm using 24 gig DIMMs and didn't, like, it helps, because the 16 gig DIMMs, like, they don't even do 7600. But, yeah, like, this right here is basically, like, kind of a bit of a trap, right? Because you might be like, oh, you know, $200 for DDR5 8000, that's not completely insane. Except that this is actually far less likely to work than this, right? Just because of like 2x24 versus 2x16. Also, I think in terms of cost per gig, this isn't that bad, is it? Yeah, because that's like less than a 50% price increase, but it is like a 50% density increase. Yeah, literally, like your price per gig is actually lower on the 2x24 kit. Anyway, and if you just care about performance, then you can just buy like a 7200 8i, like any Hynix 8i kit that's rated for like DDR5 7200, and then manually overclock it yourself. Or just leave it at 7200. That's probably the that's the least painful way of using an Intel system these days, in my opinion. So anyway, yeah, that's it for this video. I'm not probably going to be making much or really any Intel memory overclocking content. Like, I've just given up at this point. Like, I don't like the Intel memory controller. It doesn't like me. And I don't want to deal with it anymore. Also, yeah, like, I'm just done. Just like, I'm just straight up not going to bother testing Intel memory speeds. Like, the QVLs are made up and the speeds don't matter. So, there. Anyway, that's it for the video. Thank you for watching. Like, share, subscribe, leave any comments, questions, suggestions down in the comment section below. If you'd like to support what I do here with actually hardcore overclocking, I have a Patreon. There's a link to that down in the description below. There's also the HOC Teespring store where you can pick up shirts, hoodies, posters, you know, the usual YouTuber merch. And I've also got a Bandcamp. There's a link in the description to that as well. And that's it for the video. So thank you for watching, and goodbye.